Hello and welcome to your go-to Detroit Pistons podcast, The Pistons Pulse, co-hosted by me, Bryce Simon of Motor City Hoops, a former D1 Hooper, current high school coach, teacher, husband, and father of three amazing kids, and Omari Sankofa II, Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press. Omari, my guy, have you been able to catch up on any sleep since Thursday night? Because I have a feeling the end of this week might be just as crazy as the end of last week.
Yeah, I did. It definitely kind of cooled off Saturday and Sunday a little bit after a pretty busy Thursday and Friday. So we'll see for this weekend. I'm just happy that free agency starts at 6 p.m. now and not midnight, which never really made sense. Like when I was just following NBA growing up, I never thought about it. But then you start covering the NBA full time, and it's like, why are we staying up till midnight for free agency? That doesn't make sense. So we'll see this weekend, but I'm expecting I probably won't be up until 3 a.m. like I was last week. So definitely happy about that.
Good. I'm glad you caught up, man. I got a chance to over the weekend, Omari. We went to OKC first thing Friday morning, got some decent sleep. I actually got to work on some Pistons content Friday and Saturday. And then we're recording this first thing Monday morning. I got in at midnight last night from that tournament, and then we're up early this morning. So I might have to get a little nap in here Monday afternoon and catch up for the rest of the week. But for our listeners, Thursday at 6 p.m., right, Omari? I believe that's correct, is when some of these reports may start coming in on free agency. And you had an article drop recently about what you think will happen with the Pistons free agency now that the draft is over.
Yeah, that's right. Thursday at 6 p.m. is when free agency officially starts. And I know fans have been talking about DeAndre Ayton and Miles Bridges for a while. But as I wrote Monday morning, it's looking more likely that they're not going to make a big splash in free agency. And I talked about it a little bit when we dropped the late draft pod. But you get two guys in the lottery, Jaden Ivey, and then also Jalen Duren. And I don't think the Pistons expected to get both of those guys. Definitely didn't expect to get Duren going into the draft. Kind of changes the thinking and the priority for the rest of the summer. So you have six guys that you've taken in the last 3 years. And it just kind of lessens the need, I think, to spend so much cap space on one guy at center or if it's Miles Bridges, like, a guy who's a power forward, and you have Isaiah Stewart and Sadiq Bey. Just doesn't make quite as much sense. So probably less likely to make a big splash, and more likely they just bring some shooters in, because that's one thing they did not address in the draft is shooting. So I just know that people are going to ask about that a lot, and I would just say lower your expectations. Maybe you get a guy on a good deal, but probably not the biggest priority this summer now is to get that big splash in.
Yeah, I mean, I know fans are probably going to be disappointed if they don't walk away with DeAndre Ayton or Miles Bridges. It seemed like those guards were out of the equation anyway, Jalen Brunson, Colin Sexton, those guys. But it's got to be music to the fan base's ears if you hear that Troy Weaver and the front office want shooting and are going to prioritize shooting. Now, I will say we heard that last offseason as well, and it didn't necessarily come to fruition. But we will talk more about the roster and all that in segment 2. Let's talk about the two guys who maybe changed the trajectory of free agency on Thursday night, and that is Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren. We talked about him in the instant recap episode, but let's take a little deeper dive. Jaden Ivey falls, in my opinion, right into the Pistons' lap at number 5. One interesting thing is he was telling teams he is not a point guard. That was music to my ears because I don't think that's what he should play. And if he is okay with not playing that, I think that is great. How do you feel about that? What have you heard in terms of what you think the organization sees from him as far as a point guard, off guard?
Yeah, I definitely think there's an awareness from the organization that this isn't quite a Cade Cunningham situation where you have a guy that just kind of does everything and definitely processes the game like a point guard. They didn't use, I don't want to say kid gloves, but there's an awareness last year that Cade could come in and immediately be that impact type of guy. And they see Jaden Ivey that way as well. They got to make an instant impact. But Dwayne Casey also made a point to say during their introductory press conference on Friday that Ivey and Duren are both, they're young. They're rookies. They're going to be able to come in and get their feet wet. They're not going to set sky high expectations for them. And for me, I guess I'm curious if some of that is just an acknowledgement that, Killian came in and they, kind of said he's ready to go. And then, of course, that wasn't quite true. So they don't want to make that same error of sort of setting expectations too high. And then the guy ends up needing a little bit more time to adjust, which isn't an indictment on Killian, who is still 20 years old somehow, but just this is the third guard they've taken in the first round in 3 years. Actually, the third guard they've taken in the top 7 in 3 years. So, I think also already having Cade and, Corey Joseph here and then Killian, who will be in year 3, you don't need Ivy to come in and immediately have the ball in his hands. You could kind of ease them in, get them comfortable and whatnot. So I think that is good because Ivy's not a point guard. We talked about it on this pod. I think I misspoke a couple pods ago and said he was. And I do read the Detroit Bad Boys comments.
I was going to say, yeah. I had to defend you a little bit because they're like, if Amari says that Jaden Ivey's a point guard one more time, it's like, hey, listen, Amari is a smart man, basketball-wise and otherwise. He misspoke. He's not purposely calling him a point guard because he thinks he's a point guard.
Yeah, I know, guys. I know he's not a point guard. And, just misspoke. You'd speak for an hour straight. You're going to, say some things incorrectly. But bottom line is that, the Pistons know that, Ivy still has some skill development to do, and they're not going to force him or rush him in any way. He's going to be able to come in and just acclimate at his pace.
Yeah, I think you brought up something really interesting, Amari. I hadn't thought about. Cade puts up these expectations for rookies that is going to be unfair for Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren. And even Cade struggled to start last season, right? Like we all kind of, I don't want to say we forget it because we still have to defend it at times on Twitter, but Cade is different than these guys. I think we would all agree with that. And so even though I'm excited about Jaden Ivey, and we'll talk about Jalen Duren here in a few minutes, I don't think we should expect the same thing from Jaden Ivey, like just even the maturity level, because Cade was on a different level.
Yeah, it's just different. I mean, Cade comes in and you just don't have prospects who have just Cade's ability to do like a little bit of everything. Like Cade, he still only shot like 31% from 3 last year. And, the team still respect the shot and defend him that way because they know that he can shoot. Yeah, Ivy's a unique prospect, just a hyper athletic guard, still just has some skill development to take place. And for him, I think he landed in the best scenario where he can play along with a Cade and a Killian who are good at the things that he isn't. And he brings the one thing that they don't, which is just elite athleticism. So from that regard, it's a perfect fit for Ivy. And I think that would take the pressure off of him pretty early.
I've said that as well. I think it's a good fit next to Cade. I do want to talk about the fit with Killian a little bit more in just a second, but it's the absolute perfect fit for Jaden Ivey. I believe that wholeheartedly that he is in the perfect situation for him. And how about how the organization has embraced him? I didn't see all of it because I had a busy weekend, but what the organization presented jerseys to him and his family at the introductory press conference. Like all this seemed like they really rolled out the red carpet for him and his family. Can you touch on that just a little bit more and then we'll get back to the court?
Yes. So Aaron Tellum presented 3 jerseys from Jaden Ivey's family to Jaden on stage during his press conference on Friday. He presented a Detroit Lions jersey from his grandfather, James Hunter, who played for the Lions. His dad, Javin Hunter, also played in the NFL, I believe mostly for the Baltimore Ravens, but he went to Country Day. So he presented a Country Day football jersey from his dad, Javin. And then his mom, of course, played for the Shock, I believe, back in 2005. So they gave Jaden a DL Ivy jersey as well. And you can just tell how happy Jaden is to be a Piston because he kind of teared up. Like he teared up a little bit when they brought his grandfather's jersey out. And then it's like, oh, here's your daughter, your mom too. So I mean, I think they got those jerseys a few weeks in advance just in case Ivy was there. And they obviously didn't know if he would be there, but it just says a lot that, they really wanted to give him the warmest welcome possible and make him feel at home. So just a really cool story overall. I don't know if I expected the Pistons to go to that extent beforehand, and it's cool to see that happen.
Yeah, that was really cool. Like I say, I just caught bits and pieces, and so I'm kind of just learning that. Just as you were talking about that, I couldn't imagine, for myself, if I was a part of an organization, they welcome me that way. I know it would mean a lot to me moving forward. So that is really, really cool. Let's talk about what does Jaden Ivey do well in year one, Omari? We've talked about fit and all these things. What is he going to do well? What do we feel like the fan base is going to see from him? We know there's going to be some struggles, but where is he NBA ready, day one whenever he steps onto the court?
He's an NBA ready athlete, like by far. And I think that's the one thing that is going to translate immediately is his ability to get downhill and, draw fouls and finish at the rim. There's a lot said about, guys, they get to the league and the game becomes simpler because the floor is a little bit more open. And I think at times that can almost be a cliche because NBA defenses are a little bit more sophisticated. So it's not like you're just going to have like a cha-cha line to the rim. Like there's going to be different things in place to impede your progress. But like I do think Ivy immediately is just going to immediately be one of the best athletes in the NBA. You could probably count, really on one hand, if not both, the amount of guys who have a comparable first step. It's really not that many guys. Like people compare him to Ja. And that's really where the Ja comparison comes from, is just how quickly they can get to the rim, or even like Westbrook. But it's like those guys, like there's like 3 or 4 of them. So we'll see that pretty immediately, even if the shot isn't immediate, even if the passing isn't immediate, just his ability to pressure the rim, something I think the Pistons could weaponize from day one.
Yeah, I think transition, that's something I want to talk about as we go throughout the episode because of obviously the other draft pick, Jalen Duren, and if this team is going to play faster. I do want to say, Omari, I think his passing is better than people give him credit for. And I honestly can't remember if I mentioned this on Friday's episode, but he's not a high-level read guy, but I didn't think he was a selfish player by any means. And I think he can get into the lane, and if health comes, then he can make the right read to the open man. And I think that's all he has to do. He puts so much rim pressure on the defense that he's either going to score it the way you talked about, or he can just drive and kick. So I think the passing woes, quote unquote, have been a little bit overblown. Is he throwing Cade and Killian whip passes? No, probably not. Hopefully he develops that a little bit more. But I think his being a bad passer is a little more overblown than actual reality. Before we talk about Jalen Duren, how do you think Ivy and Killian fit? Because, do you want Jaden Ivey to run the second unit with the ball in his hand some? Or do you think when he does play with Killian Hayes, they still put the ball in Killian's hands and Ivy's off ball? Can we play Killian, Cade, and Jaden Ivey all together?
We say this a lot, if he could shoot, right? Like, this is a fit with Killian if he could shoot. So there's like this theoretical fit where Killian's knocking down open threes. And then there's, the reality of the fit, if the Killian's the same player as he was last year, where he's not spacing the floor, and maybe that hurts things a little bit. But I think if you have Killian sort of in like that similar 6-man row, he's coming into the game halfway through the first quarter, finishing the first half, maybe finishing some fourth quarters. It could still work, especially if Ivy could like knock down open threes, which I think he'll be able to. Like Ivy did shoot like 36% from 3 last season.
Yeah, catch and shoot, I think he's going to be fine. Like it's a set shot. People are super worried. Maybe it's not movement off the dribble stuff, Omari, but catch and shoot, like I don't have a ton of concerns.
I don't have a lot of concerns either. Like he'll keep defenses honest. And like I think that could work, like him and Killian together. Like again, it's not like, like a completely perfect fit. But, as far as Killian being able to take the harder defensive assignment, move the ball. And then, if Ivy's active on cuts, of course, Ivy has that athleticism that Killian doesn't have. So, Ivy could even create for Killian some as well. If Killian can knock down those open shots. Like, I think there's upside there for sure, just because I think you really should pair Killian with somebody who's more athletic than he is to get a little bit more juice out of that backcourt. Like, I think Cade and Killian can fit next to each other. And you probably can play all 3 of those guys next to each other as well, since Cade is, 6'6" with a big wingspan, so he can defend a lot of small forwards. Like, as long as 2 of those guys can shoot, like, I think you're probably in pretty good shape, because you're not going to have all 3 guys. I mean, you even look at Boston in the finals. Derek White's not a great shooter, but Derek White can, make passing reads and defend at a high level. So you can always have those guys on the court as long as you have enough shooting around them.
Cade's the one that makes that work, especially if he's put on a little strength and muscle and can defend, down, I guess, or up into, the 3 spot in that lineup. We keep talking about athleticism. The guy who has a ton of athleticism as well is who the Pistons work to get at number 13. In a roundabout way, essentially, this was part of the Jeremy Grant trade, turned into number 13, some second-round picks, cap space. We've outlined all of that. We'll continue to talk about it. But Jalen Duren, the young man out of Memphis, Omari, one of the youngest players in the draft, even though he has played 1 year of college basketball. I want to start here, and then we'll work our way through. I tweeted out my kind of fun starting lineup for the Detroit Pistons, and it had Jalen Duren in it. And a lot of people are like, he's not going to be ready. He's going to spend time in the G League. Where do you think Jalen Duren is? Where do you feel like the organization thinks Jalen Duren is, just in terms of his progression as an NBA player?
So we asked Troy and Dwayne about that, and Troy said, it's up to the player. Honestly, some guys are ready to go immediately. Some guys aren't, and you don't always know how ready a player is going to be when you bring them in. And then Dwayne, same with Jaden Ivey. These guys are young kids. We're not going to expect a word of them from day one. We're going to bring them in at their own pace. With that said, Jalen Duren is the only Jalen Duren on the roster. And when I say that, I mean he is the only guy who is like a genuine kind of like vertical lob threat, but also has the tools to be a really, really good defender.
Sorry, Marvin Bagley.
It's pretty obvious what I'm talking about here. Because of that, I wonder if he'll have a pretty big role early on, just because it's hard to see why he wouldn't be able to just play that role pretty immediately. The rim protection, I think on some level centers are going to have to learn the NBA pace, NBA game. He might struggle with fouls and whatnot. But on the other hand, he was already a pretty good rim protector for Memphis last season, despite being the age of a high school senior. So his growth curve is already pretty strong for how young he is. I mean, if he was 2 years older, I still think he would have been in the lottery conversation because of his skill set, but will still be 18 years old on opening night. So he's extremely young and already pretty skilled. But also, if I'm Dwayne and, I have a guy in Duren who, has some rim protection upside, let's say he's an average rim protector from day one, which already puts him in we kind of have to play him territory. And then he's also a 7'5" wingspan. His lob radius is huge. So you have 4 guards really who are, dropping off lobs to him. We saw Killian and Cade utilize Bagley last year. It wouldn't shock me if Duren is a rotation guy from day one, honestly. It wouldn't shock me. I could just see him, the role he's in, you may just have to play him and just pray that he can hold his own defensively.
That was kind of the debate on Twitter, and it got pretty deep with some people. I do think he fits a role immediately, Amari. All the things you're talking about, obviously a lob threat, rim runner in transition, offensive rebounds, those things, put him in the dunker spot. I like his defense. Obviously, there's going to be a growth curve there, right? Even Dyson Daniels, who everybody loves as a defender, Jeremy Sohan, who everybody loves as a defender, there's going to be a growth curve for those guys as well. But I think he can block shots and do those things. I think there's a switchability with him as well, which is really exciting if him and Stu can play together. But do you play him in that role where it's a little bit smaller of a box? Or the argument was you send him to the G League, Amari, so he can work on the development of his short roll passing, short roll floater game, his mid-range jumper, those other things that are going to take his ceiling even higher. How do you balance that this year if you're the Pistons? Do you send them back and forth? Or is it saying, You do these things for us during games, work on those other things in practice and develop them then?
I guess part of this for me depends on what happens in free agency, right? If you're extremely deep at center, so, your rotation's pretty full with Stewart, Olynyk, Bagley, and then you also have Duren. Maybe that becomes a bit more likely. The Pistons will always say that the Motor City Crews are here for that purpose, to develop our guys. We're not going to treat it as we're sending somebody to the gulag or whatever, it's like a positive, productive thing to go to the Motor City Crews and, develop your skill. With that said, they have not actually assigned a first round pick to the Motor City Crews outside of last year when Cade was hurt. And then he was coming back and, getting back from that ankle injury. So does that change with Duren, given how young he is? Right now, I would say I'd probably be more surprised to see him in the G League. I think it would have to be him struggling significantly for them to say, yeah, let's bring him on a little bit more slowly with the cruise. But I guess one, will he struggle significantly? Yeah, I mean, that's TBD, but I feel like he's skilled enough already to where he probably won't. And then two, because, as we just talked about, he's the only player on the roster who has that vertical spacing and rim protection. And outside of Isaiah Stewart, there's really nobody else on the roster who's a good rim protector. So if Duran is at least average, that's going to count for a lot. It may just be the situation where he's just already an NBA player anyway, and you don't have to do it. I say a big difference between the G League and the NBA is that you don't see a lot of legitimate rim protectors in the G League because those guys are in the NBA because NBA teams need them. So that's already one thing in Duran's favor to not be assigned to the cruise.
If he goes down there, like how much is he going to get to work on his short roll passing and shooting and stuff? Because he may just be catching lobs over everybody that's down there anyway. And possibly, like, I don't mean to say, like, maybe he ends up developing bad habits I haven't watched enough G League to know. I watched a little bit when I was doing Dyson Daniels, Jaden Hardy breakdowns. And like, there's not a lot of defense always played down there. Like, so sometimes I wonder how much of the development is coming. That's a whole nother thing for another episode. One last thing, because I thought this was a really cool idea or note from Wes as he put in this outline. Again, always shout out Wes Davenport, who puts in the outline for us. Would a lineup of Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Hamidou Diallo, who is on a team option. We'll know about that very, very soon. Actually, by the Tuesday evening when you're listening to this, Marvin Bagley III and Jalen Duran. Would that be the most athletic five-man lineup we've seen in a while in Detroit? Cade, Ivey, Hami, Bagley, and Duran?
Probably, yeah. I mean, you have plus athletes at every position except point guard, and Cade is still, an above-average athlete. Like,
all he has to do is throw the ball to the rim and let one of those guys go get it.
Yeah, that's all he has to do. That's also probably the worst shooting lineup you can put together where, Ivey's your second best shooter in that lineup by a pretty significant margin. But athleticism-wise, yeah, like maybe you could just outrun guys and, just constantly assault the rim and have some success that way.
Talking about an athletic lineup, we may see one in Summer League if second-round pick Gabriel Procida is there to play with Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duran, and we will talk about him when we come back for segment 2.
All right, hey, Carlos, just a quick idea. How about if I say, hey, this is Sean Windsor, and you say, hey, this is Carlos Morales, and I'll go, and then we'll go back. You want to try that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Hey, this is Sean Windsor.
And this is Carlos Monarez.
And we are the team behind Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean, where we are going to talk about, you guessed it, sports, but lots of other stuff. Like what, Carlos?
Oh, we're going to talk about your favorite subject, Sean, food. Probably more food. Arts, culture, sports, TV, movies, you name it. If it's happened in Detroit, we're going to talk about it.
And sometimes we're going to have guests in who obviously know a lot more than we do about just about everything. But we're going to have some free press journalists to talk about big stories, folks from the sports world. We're going to be out every Thursday. You can find this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. We hope you'll join us.
We're back here with the Pistons Post segment 2, and we're going to get into Pistons second round and then, their undrafted free agent guys and sort of what we could see in Summer League, which is coming up pretty quickly here in about 9 or 10 days. So they did have one second round pick, Gabriel Procida, who a lot of people have been curious about. Draft a stash guy, but seems to have pretty good upside. I mean, he was a sharpshooter over in Italy. Decent enough athleticism, 20 years old. I'm not going to pretend I knew a lot about the guy before the Pistons drafted him, but a lot of the draft analysts who follow the international prospects seem to be pretty excited about him. So definitely a guy to be curious about. Bryce, I don't know if you've had a chance to dive into any film on him, but sort of what have you seen from what he's produced so far?
Yeah, like I said, it was kind of a busy weekend for me coaching the high school team in OKC, but I did get to watch one film, Omari, and you see the things that people are talking about, the shooting, and it wasn't just catch and shoot, which I think is always interesting to me, right? Like a lot of guys can be catch and shoot, but he's coming off the staggered. So we see the Pistons run this all the time. Ball's on the right side of the floor. They run a stagger to the left, and Sadiq or whoever's coming off the stagger. Prashida can catch and shoot it. He can put it on the floor, pull up at 15 feet. Haven't seen him get to the rim as much. The handle's a little shaky, but the athleticism, a lot of video clips have started making their rounds on Twitter with him dunking like in like pickup games or workouts. And then he had a block in the game that I watched that I tweeted out that is impressive just because of how high he jumped, if nothing else. So he is interesting. And you and I were texting back and forth this weekend about draft and stash. It sounds like the Pistons hold his rights until they're ready for him to come over, or until he's ready to come over. I think he can say, hey, I'm ready to come over, and then the Pistons have 12 months to bring him in, or essentially his rights are waived or are free for him to sign with anybody else. So definitely a name, I think, more than Balsa was, Omari, to keep an eye on over the next 12, 18, 24 months.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy that clearly has an NBA skill set, being a 6'8" sharpshooter, who could also attack some closeouts. Maybe has some upside on defense as well.
The defense was interesting. It wasn't awful. He moves his feet decent. I don't think he's gonna be a plus defender, but I think he can hold his own, Omari.
If he could be average, then yeah, I mean that's an NBA guy. And I would throw out that the Pistons were looking to trade that pick before they did take him. So I think that their priority was more so we just don't want to bring another young guy into the fold. They ended up not trading it, so getting a draft stash type guy was the next best case scenario, which makes sense. You have 6 first-round picks in 3 years. You should have some recent second-round guys on the roster with Isaiah Livers and whatnot. So, how young can this team get? And then you also probably want to save some roster spots for free agency as well. So I know a lot of people were curious about when we're going to see him come over to the U.S. And I don't know, that's up to the Pistons and that's up to him, right? That's not something I can really predict. But I think the upside for the Pistons was just he's a guy who we could keep overseas until our roster is a little bit more settled. And I feel like most draft size guys probably don't really pan out, but just as a 6'8" guy that can shoot, there's always going to be some intrigue there, I think.
If I was going to nitpick Troy Weaver's draft, it was this pick, Omari, because I was juiced because guys like Jaden Hardy, E.J. Liddell, Bryce McGowens, Ryan Rollins, even Ishmael Kamagate, a big guy who may end up being draft and stash as well, were on the board. But I understood it a little bit more whenever I spoke with you and you told me, hey, the Pistons were trying to trade out of this. And that made sense. Either, like you said, they don't want yet another young guy on the roster, or I feel like it's probably roster spots, right? It comes down to it. Troy Weaver knows a little bit what his free agency plan is and that they need to bring in 2 quote unquote veteran, or I don't know if they're going to end up being veterans because Malik Monk's name is coming out and he's not necessarily a vet, but he's been in the league for a few years. He knows they're going to sign a couple of those guys and they don't have the roster spot for a Jaden Hardy or Bryce McGowens, EJ Liddell. And that's why they went with the draft and stash. The one thing I don't know that either of us have got clarification on is, will Prashida play in Summer League, or can a second round draft and stash even be able to or eligible to? I would assume they're eligible to, but maybe they don't usually do it. I don't have a for sure understanding or grasp of how that necessarily works just yet.
I've covered a lot of draft and stash guys since I started covering the league. So yeah, so we'll see. I think we did see Bossa on the Summer League roster last year after that deal was finally consummated. So it wouldn't shock me if we do see him in Vegas this summer. But I think we'll probably be getting that roster for the next weekish or so. So we'll have an answer for that soon.
One other guy, we don't have to dive into him. I am going to do a deep dive film breakdown because that's what I do on Buddy Boeheim out of Syracuse. And I think the interesting thing with him as an undrafted free agent was he got one of the 2-way spots. So that means either Jamarco Pickett or Braxton Key will end up within the organization in another way, either on the active 15-man roster, which I would assume doesn't happen. Maybe they're just straight G League. Maybe they end up with another organization. But Buddy Boeheim was signed as an undrafted free agent to take up one of those 2-way spots. And I think the personal connection is interesting of note. You were talking to me before the episode that his father, Jim Boeheim, obviously the legendary coach at Syracuse, Troy Weaver was an assistant for Boeheim at one point in his career.
There's the Syracuse connection there. Troy Weaver was an assistant coach under Jim Boeheim at Syracuse. And, of course, Troy still has that pretty strong Syracuse connection. But Buddy's just a guy that can really shoot. I forget his stats offhand, but he shot the ball at high volume throughout his 4 years of college. And I know that percentage dipped a little bit his senior season, but overall, he was still a productive, high-volume shooter. I think I kind of saw some people who were like, why are we just signing Jim Boeheim's son? But, for a two-way deal, like most two ways aren't going to work out, obviously, but he obviously could fill a key need just as a guy who can knock down threes. And then you just got to look at the Miami Heat, and they've had luck with guys who were, like really under the radar but could shoot the ball.
Max
and then end up
Strus.
working out. Max Strus, Nick Stauskas. You never know. And Buddy, like, it's not like he's like a 5'10" dude who shot a lot of threes. He's like 6'6", has like actual NBA size as well. I think that makes sense. Clearly, if you look at who they went with the 36th pick and now Buddy, and both of these guys can shoot. Pistons are very clearly trying to find other avenues to fill that need as well.
Good. Like the team needs shooting. Like find out if maybe he can defend a little bit better than what people may think. Or obviously he played a lot of zone in his college career playing for his dad at Syracuse. But yeah, I mean, this kid, he's 6'6", Omari. So like you said, he's not like some 5'10" guy. Averaged 15, 18, and 19 over his last 3 years. The shooting percentage from three, 37, 38. It did dip this last season down to 34. But I did watch some Syracuse games and he's taking like tough threes. It's not like it's just wide open catch and shoot stuff. So interesting guy. I'm sure we'll see him in Summer League. Hopefully he shoots it really well. And we'll see how that goes. I do another note just for the Summer League roster. They signed up Howard's Kyle Foster, who shot 46% from three at Howard this past season. He'll play in the Summer League with the Pistons. I would assume next week's episode, Amari, we will probably have the full Summer League roster for that one. Obviously, a bunch of free agency news, so we'll be able to dive into it just a little bit more on next week's episode before you and I are out there to see the Pistons in person. Before we go to segment 3, where we're going to talk about the NBA draft, just a little bit more in general, the winners, the losers, things we liked and didn't like. Let's just talk about how this roster is starting to shape up ahead of free agency. You've already mentioned, and again, always read Omari Sankofa II on the Detroit Free Press. Go check out his article on kind of the change in direction of the free agency offseason for the Pistons. There was also a report that came out that the Pistons are likely to pick up Hamidou Diallo's team option, but not Frank Jackson's team option. We've been talking about shooting. That's something Frank was supposed to be able to do. Do you find that interesting that they would actually pick up Hami's, but maybe not Frank's?
Yeah, I think the thing with Frank is that his shooting has been more in theory than like the reality. And he dipped, pretty bad last season. And, just at his size, he's about 6'2" or 6'3", but not really a point guard at all. He's like purely like an off-ball shooter who can occasionally attack closeouts, and at his size, can't handle that many defensive assignments as well. I think it makes sense, and I was curious to see if either of those guys would come back, just because that backcourt's already getting pretty crowded. But Hami had a solid season last year, just as a guy who brings energy and athleticism off of the bench. And I think we had this debate like in one of the early episodes of the podcast, like if Hami could become like a league average shooter, which is a big if, how would he compare next to a guy like Frank, since Hami might be a little bit more toolsy overall. So we'll see. I don't like Hami and Jaden Ivey is a super, super athletic backcourt. And, you need one of those guys to be able to shoot for it to work. But if Ivey can shoot, put him next to Hami, you're getting up and down the court. I think there's just an awareness from the front office that this team needs to be able to shoot, but it needs to be more athletic as well. When you have a team that has Cade, Sadiq, Isaiah, these are some of your key guys, and they're not necessarily like plus athletes. You got to get, some more bounciness around them. So, I think I see the logic as Hami being more of a long-term upside guy.
Yeah, and Hami's interesting because I feel like we forgot about him just a little bit. I was looking at the game log, and he didn't play he played one of the last 17, 18 games of the season. So he was one of those guys that was wasn't playing at the end of the year. What was it, a thumb?
It was a finger injury.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we didn't see him too much in the month of March at all.
So yeah, he was setting it. So I think we kind of forget him just a little bit. This does make sense. And like I said, you say it perfectly with Frank Jackson. Like the shooting has been much more in theory than reality with Frank Jackson. And then as an undersized guard, who's probably, I don't know if he's a liability defensively, but smaller guards, it's a little tougher for them to at least be positives defensively. I do want to ask this question because I think it's interesting ahead of Thursday's free agency. Do you think the starting five on opening night is currently already on the roster, Omari?
I think there's a good chance. I see an outside chance for one guy in free agency cracking the starting lineup, but I think if you assume
what guy, what guy? Tell what guy specifically.
I have no clue what guy it is. But yeah, Pistons don't know which guy it is yet. Yeah, but it wouldn't surprise me if at least 4 of the guys are already on the roster. I mean, I think Cade, Sadiq, Isaiah, that's pretty safe. And I can see Ivy being a starter opening night as well. I think he fits in pretty well next to Cade. And you just look at, Killian being a day one starter, Cade being a day one starter. Sadiq did come off the bench his first 2 games, but he started every game since. The Pistons have been pretty forward about, giving their guys a lot of minutes early on. So I guess the question for me is just like that front court, are you comfortable with, Isaiah, Sadiq, and then you have somebody come in at the 3, or, just exactly how do you handle that part of it? So that's more of a TBD, but I could see 4 of the guys for sure.
Okay, so that's more of my realistic question. What position, because I agree with you. I think those are probably the 4. So what position do you think they go try to find to start? Like, do they need a 3 and you start Bey at the 4 and Stu at the 5? Do you go find a 4 so Bey can start at the 3? Or like we've talked about this a little bit, do they believe in Stewart's jumper? Like, do you go find a 5 that starts next to Isaiah and you play Isaiah at the 4? Do you have any sort of sense of what position, or is it just end up the best player available almost that they can acquire in free agency and you just kind of figure it out?
It could be best player available and then you figure it out. I think for one, you just look at this free agency class and there's not a lot of like, this guy could fill this spot, but other teams are going to want this guy as well. Like a Taurean Prince, he's a forward, shot the ball pretty well. Could probably play both front court spots. I mean, he would be perfect. But do you bring him in, or is it more likely you bring in a Malik Monk or a Gary Harris or a Wesley Matthews? It seems like there's probably a few more backcourt shooters available than guys in the front court. So potentially we could see Cade play a lot of I'll say this in quotes, quote unquote 3. Like he'd still be like the lead ball handler, but maybe you play him next to an Ivy and a Gary Harris, or an Ivy and a Brent Forbes, or Killian and Wes Matthews, or whoever. So I think it's just more so just find shooters and then let Dwayne Casey get to work. I don't know, especially with this class, I just don't know if you'll be able to find like that the perfect person who rounds out the rotation the way you would like it to be.
That's really interesting. I hadn't even thought about that in the starting lineup. So you truly could bring in Gary Harris and start defensively, Gary Harris and Jaden Ivey in the backcourt, Cade at the 3, again, we're in quotes here, and then Bey at the 4 and Stu at the 5, right? Like that's definitely a possibility.
It's a possibility. Or, they just concede with Kojo, and then you have Kojo, Ivy, Cade, and then Bey and like Stu again. So, I mean, that could be the starting lineup right there. It wouldn't shock me if they continue to stick with Corey Joseph, to the delight of
I was going to say, yeah, whenever Keith Smith, I don't remember what Keith Smith said, and you told him that, he brought up the Josh Smith contract, and you told him the listeners turned off the episode. We may have just lost a few there, because people are going to be livid, Omari. We know that if Corey Joseph is starting opening night, especially if there was a world where he was starting and Jaden Ivey is not. What about a couple names? Like Bobby Portis is a name that continues to come up. I use him, Omari, as an example of, I have a hard time understanding guys like him, even Gary Harris. Why would they not just go to a contender? And I know we've talked again with Keith Smith about overpaying them, even if it's just for a year. Maybe they do that. But to me, I feel like those guys are placing their career where they're going to go play for a contender, even if it's for $1 million or $2 million less than what the Pistons would offer. Am I off base on that, thinking that like a guy like Bobby Portis probably isn't a realistic option unless you like extremely overpay and probably tack on more years or something to that contract?
I don't know about Bobby Portis specifically, given that he is on a team that he won a championship with. But there's always going to be road guys who don't sign with contenders for a variety of reasons. The contender interest may be lukewarm, or they may not have the money they want to pay. And the Pistons, given that, somewhere in their priority list is still maintaining some flexibility for 2023, unless the perfect opportunity comes to just add that core piece this summer. They could do something where, let's say Gary's best theoretical contract from a contender is like 3 years, 18 million or something. And the Pistons say, hey, we'll give you 2 years, 10 million, but the second year is partially guaranteed. So, Gary Harris is still getting a guaranteed 12 billion. And then he could also hit the market again next summer and get like a new deal. I think that's where that flexibility comes in, because the Pistons could do those creative, like 2 year, 3 year with a team option, a partial guarantee mixed in, and guys make more money up front and then can hit the market sooner. Players always have different priorities, and the market doesn't always work out the way players expect. And for some players, it'll be, okay, I couldn't get with a contender, but, I can play for like this up and coming, young Pistons team with a guy in Cade Cunningham who could be fun to play with. And additionally, I get a little bit more money in my pocket in a short amount of time, and I can figure things out again next summer or the summer after. So, yeah, I think the Pistons will be able to find a shooter. There's only so many contenders with actual money to spend. And once you get kind of past like the MLE deals they'll send out and whatnot, you're going to see guys kind of settle and just take the next best thing that they can get.
That's really interesting, because what they could do, someone like Gary Harris could go sign and play with the Pistons for like 2 years, a 1+1, and then he's going to hit the market again when the salary cap, it's not going to spike like they did, what was that, in 2014 when all those ridiculous contracts were handed out, but the salary cap is going to start increasing. So maybe he goes and gets a little bit of extra money for the next 2 years, then he can go back into the market when the salary cap's going up and maybe some contenders have more money to spend. So that would be really interesting. Before we go to segment 3 and talk about the draft in general, can you do a prediction? Let's just do a prediction what we think is going to happen Thursday night. You can do specific names. I have specific names. We didn't prep this. So Amari, if you don't have specific names, but what would be your prediction for the first couple days of free agency for the Pistons? I'll go ahead and let you think. I think they sign Malik Monk and take on a bad contract with future assets. That's what I think the rest of this free agency plays out. Obviously, some other maybe smaller moves. So Hami comes back, Marvin Bagley III comes back, Frank walks, they bring in Malik Monk, and they trade for a bad contract that they get future assets for.
I think I'll be in the same boat. I can see them going out, bringing in a couple shooters in free agency. And then I can see some sort of trade that balances the roster in some way. And maybe it's a bad contract, or maybe it's just, like a slightly overpaid role player, not like a bad contract per se, but a player that the other team's just like, we could invest these resources elsewhere. And the Pistons, you get a vet who could shoot the ball, and it's like mutually beneficial. So definitely smaller scale moves as opposed to, just backing up the Brinks truck to DeAndre Ayton and crossing your fingers.
Remember, free agency on Thursday night, 6 p.m. Eastern. We will not have a special episode for that because we don't know when the Pistons news will break. We will obviously be back next week on Tuesday to break all that down. But stay with us. We still got one more segment here. We're going to recap the entire NBA draft. Not everything, but with some of the top storylines for Amari and I, winners, losers, biggest surprises, best fits. And we'll do that after this short break.
I'm Alyssa Robinson for the Detroit Free Press. When you wake up every morning, what's the first thing you do? Check your email? Me too. And when you sign up for our daily briefing newsletter, you'll get all the latest news sent directly to your inbox so you can wake up and be ready for the day. We also have newsletters about COVID-19 in Michigan, the latest entertainment headlines, as well as Woodward 248, a newsletter specifically for people living and working in Southeast Oakland County. And don't forget about automotive headlines and all the latest news from our Michigan sports teams. We have a newsletter for every personality and preference. Just head to freep.com/newsletters to sign up for any one of these great options and more.
All right, we're back with segment 3, recapping the NBA draft as a whole. And let's just start off by just tossing this question out. Were the Pistons the biggest overall winner? Because I think there are other teams who have an argument, like OKC had a pretty good night. But I think as far as a team, just kind of getting lucky twice and ending up with two of the best prospects without having to give much up. like you could argue pound for pound, the Pistons had the best night. And I think I actually would say the Pistons had the best night just because Ali and Duran is one of the best hauls in the draft. And there are two guys that entering the night, it didn't seem like the Pistons were in position to acquire.
It's funny because, like, all of a sudden the next day, Pistons fans are like, is this bad that everybody's saying that the Pistons won the draft? You know how you change the narrative all of a sudden? You get excited about it, but then all the sports talk shows are talking about Detroit. And I even have that mentality a little bit more. I'm like, I don't want Stephen A. talking about us. I don't want Kendrick Perkins talking. I just leave us all alone. Let Detroit do what it does, and we'll sneak up on you guys in a couple years. But it was cool to see them kind of be the talk of the town there for a while, talk of the country, the NBA community. You know who I like, Amari? And the Houston Rockets. I do. I think Jabari Smith Jr. falling to them at 3, I think that's a great fit for them. It gives them a defensive presence. It's an immediate replacement of Christian Wood. Not that he's as tall as Christian Wood, but he's better version because he can shoot it better and he defends. I like Tari Eason, especially where they got Tari Eason. I thought that was a really good pick for them at number 17. And then they got Ty Washington, maybe the best true, like quote unquote, true point guard in the class. Like he may start for them this season, and they got him at the end of the first round. So I like those 3 picks for the Houston Rockets.
No, I agree.
He's your guy. You like Tari Eason.
Yeah, I like Tari, and I also talked about Ty being like the next Kentucky guard who comes into the league and looks like a lot better. So I think Houston is my number 2. The only reason why I take the Pistons over them is because Houston had the 3rd pick and the Pistons had the 5th. So Houston was guaranteed to get one of the top 3 guys of the draft, and the Pistons were not guaranteed to get one of the top 4 guys of the draft. So really, maybe that makes the Kings a bigger loser than it makes the Pistons a winner. But I would say, like Houston, like absolutely, like that's probably my number 2. To get Jabari Smith Jr. at number 3. And we could talk about this later, but I also thought it was curious that Banchero did end up going number 1 after it seemed like Jabari was pretty set in that spot. But I think he's a great fit for that roster. Like I thought Banchero and Jalen Green would have been like a really fun pairing, and it kind of puts him into that Banchero into that immediate like kind of playmaking role. But yeah, I mean Jabari Smith Jr. He like just the best off-ball shooter in the entire draft at 6'10". Had a great argument to go number 1. So the fact that he went number 3 is really curious to me in a league that values shooting. But yeah, I think they went 3 for 3 on their first round picks. Ty Washington had a fantastic season until he got hurt. But he's just like really, really shifty. He's got good vision, good size. He's not quite like Tyrese Maxey, but I see some similarities in just like how good their touch is from mid-range. And like guys like that to me are going to end up being above average point guards. I do think that by the time he's due for an extension, he'll be an above average point guard. But Tari Eason is just like a big toolsy guy. If everything breaks right for him, he could be Jeremy Grant. And he's still like a little raw and has some improvement to make. But yeah, just a really good draft for him for sure. And they're kind of like the Pistons where they have a room for the young guys. And it's like, what does this become in 2 years?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of how I see it too. Like Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun. Like Green had a really good post All-Star break. As much as we talk about Cade Cunningham's post All-Star break, Jalen Green really did. And I know some Pistons fans still don't like that, and I'm cool with it. And then Sengun, I know they're super high on Sengun because some Rockets fans didn't want Paolo because he was going to take away from what Sengun does. But I do like what they're getting there. Let's talk about Paolo real quick because I actually have the Magic as a winner, or I at least like with it because I had Paolo as the number 1 player on my board. I thought he was the best player in the draft. I think he's going to be the best player in the draft. Well, I think Jaden Ivey's going to be the best player in the draft now that he's in Detroit. But, Paolo is really good. How crazy was that? I was listening to a podcast this morning as I was working out. I got to work out before we record so I can get my energy and my juice going. The coffee doesn't always just do it. But they were talking about how, the betting odds moved and then they moved and nobody knew it. And Paolo didn't know it till 7 minutes before the draft started, whatever it was. Were you like completely shocked by that as everybody else? Like, what were you thinking when all of a sudden it was Paolo?
Yeah, it was surprising for sure because pretty much all the draft guys that morning were pretty set that it would be Jabari Smith with an outside chance of it being Chet. And then, yeah, like as you said, like the betting market shifted, and then it was like, oh, like what's going on here? A couple mock drafts, a couple of like the main mock drafts ended up getting updated like an hour or 2 before the draft. Like, oh, actually, it's going to be Paolo now. But to me, I thought, like, I guess the thing for me, like the difference between Paolo and Jabari going number 1 is that it's almost like the difference between like it going for like a potential elite quarterback, like an elite wide receiver, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
if you're a rebuilding team, you could take the wide receiver and you have a good piece, but will you be able to maximize that guy if you don't have the playmaking? And you watch the finals, and you have guys like Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and those are like your engines per se. Whereas you put the ball in their hands, and they can create something. Even if they're having an off night, like they're going to be able to play make or do something, right? And the Orlando Magic, who have not had a lot of success, of course, in the last decade, are just like, let's just get the engine, like let's just get the guy who we can put the ball in his hands. And he's going to create. Like they just took Suggs last year, but Suggs didn't have a great rookie season, so let's just check that box, and then we know we can surround him with talent and be all right, rather than taking Jabari Smith Jr., who elite shooter, but if you're a rebuilding team, we'd be able to maximize his skill set to the same extent. You probably still need like that big playmaking type of guy. So, I just thought like that was an interesting thought experiment, and there's no like right or wrong answer. But I guess that's the analogy I would lose is you're a rebuilding team. Do you take the shot at the swing on the QB, and if it works out, you're set for the next decade, or do you go for the wide receiver and maybe you just can't maximize his skill set as much as you would want because you still don't have that playmaker?
I like that analogy, Amari. That was nice, man. I didn't know you got the football mind like that. That was really good.
There we go. Yeah, I watched the Lions as much as the Pistons for a while growing up. So there we go.
You're gonna have Lions fans in the comments section because they went. I wasn't a receiver, obviously, but they haven't gone for that high upside quarterback yet. We don't need to get into that. And then we'll be talking about Jared Goff and all sorts of craziness.
Yeah,
so I like the analogy though.
Yeah, it's not like a 1-1 comparison because shooters get hot, wide receivers can't get hot without a good quarterback. But that's how I see it. You're the Orlando Magic. It's like, let's just get Banchero. We can put the ball in his hands, and he's going to make plays regardless. Like, I think for them, it's an acknowledgement of this is the safest pick for us.
And I think it's an acknowledgement that maybe Suggs and Fultz and Cole, and like those guys aren't that. They're not going to do that. But now they can play a secondary role where maybe they're in the right role. We talk about it all the time, how being in the right role helps you be successful. I just think it's super interesting, Amari. All three of those guys, the top four were all bit, fours at least, play four. But those top three all are going to probably start their careers as four-man, but they were such different prospects. Every single one of those guys is completely different. We're talking about Paolo as the engine, a creator. We're talking about Chet as this elite defensive anchor, stretch big to start, maybe more to his game as he develops. And then Jabari Smith Jr. is the shooter. That was what was so interesting about this draft is those top three, they all play the same position and they all play it completely different.
Yeah, no, they have a lot of guys in the room who are all toolsy, different. Like you mentioned Cole Anthony and some of the guys in that backcourt, like exactly how do they feel in? Now that you have Banchero, like are we going to see like what does your front court look like next year? Like Mo Bamba is a free agent,
restricted free agent. Yep.
Yeah, restricted free agent. So does he come back or not? Yeah, we haven't seen Jonathan Isaac in a couple of years. Franz Wagner could probably play the 3 or the 4. But they have a lot of interesting pieces, and it'll be curious to see how they decide to kind of get these guys to all fit together. But I think with that roster, I think just the biggest need, if you just look at it as a whole, is just one guy that can consistently make plays every single time they're down the court. And I mean, Franz is that guy, but does he top out as like a star or like more of like an elite role player, which, I guess I'm still kind of mixed on. But Banchero will make everybody's life easier. Cole Anthony started off hot, but kind of fell off as his efficiency dipped. Markelle Fultz, I really don't know what to make of him. And then Suggs, I mean, like it's just tough to adapt as a point guard in the NBA. And I think Banchero just raises their floor as a whole as one guy who could do a little bit of everything and take pressure off everybody else.
All right, so we've talked about some of the big winners. Let's talk about some of the losers, or just some picks maybe that made us scratch our head. Maybe not even the whole draft in general, but maybe some picks. I'm gonna start off with the Knicks. I don't even know if I understand everything the Knicks have done. I've tried it so many times, Omari. It did make me feel a little bit better listening to other podcasts talk about how they couldn't keep track of everything the Knicks did. Essentially, they traded 11 for future first. They traded future first for Jalen Duren, and then they traded Jalen Duren for another, all sorts of craziness. Essentially, they came out with no actual draft picks, didn't create that much cap space. They do have some future firsts. I don't know what the protections or who they're from. Were the Knicks a loser on draft night, or were they smarter than the rest of us? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't quite know what they did either. I've seen several recaps of how many picks they moved, and it just seems like they just did a lot for little to no return at all. Like, I'm not really sure what the game plan was there, or if they sort of had like an end game that didn't like come together the way they expected. Like, I know their biggest priority this summer appears to be signing Jalen Brunson, and that will probably decide the fate of their offseason as they continue to piece a team around Julius Randle, who of course had a down year last year. But I really don't know what they did. But when you make like 8 moves on draft night and you don't really have a lot to show for it, then you have teams that like very clearly won the draft night as well. I think that they would be a loser for sure. Like, I don't know what they did. Like, I know that they were involved in like that Pistons deal. And, folks are like, what is New York getting out of this? And I'm like, well, they got off of Kemba's contract. And beyond that, I'm not really sure. It's not like Kemba was making $30 million. So, like, yeah, you clear some money, but, that's not like a contract that was maybe imperative to get off of. So, yeah, I'm a little confused by that as well. Like, I didn't think that there were like a lot of just like outright losers that night. Like, you kind of look up and down. I thought a lot of teams did good work with like what they had. I thought it was interesting that Charlotte got offered the 13th pick, basically for future capital. They got 4 seconds from the Knicks, and then like that future first. And for them, like, I just kind of saw that as like, well, they don't want to add 2 young players. They're trying to maintain some cap flexibility to potentially bring Miles Bridges back. So you save money by not bringing in 2 lottery picks, or 1 lottery pick and then the 15th pick. And also, they've needed a center since forever, and you're picking between Duren and Mark Williams, and you go with Mark Williams. I would say that maybe that is bad business, just in the sense that Duren is probably more of the longer-term upside guy. But with that said, like, I also like Mark Williams enough to where, like, I'll just kind of give their night like an okay. Like, I get what you were going for. Maybe it's not like the best use of an asset, but for your needs, and if you think Mark Williams is the better long-term bet, which you might be right. Not bad business by any means, but definitely not exciting business either.
Just a few first-round picks that I scratched my head at. The Timberwolves took Walker Kessler. I think Walker Kessler, even though he's a great shot blocker or was a historic shot blocker, I think he chases shot block, and I'm interested to see. I love David Roddy, but the Grizzlies taking him when they did was very interesting. And then my absolute least favorite pick of the entire night, Wes is laughing because he knows where this is going. He loved this on the live feed, was Peyton Watson to the Nuggets at number 30. I looked it up the other day, Omari. I was playing my senior year on a torn ACL at American, and I almost averaged more points than Peyton Watson did this past season. Now, completely different levels, but I don't understand it. I don't get it with Peyton Watson, but that's why I'm living in Lake in Kansas, and other people make huge amounts of money to do scouting and all that. But that was my least favorite pick of the night. Here's a couple interesting ones. Jaden Hardy. I think he's a winner because I like where he's going to Dallas. But Jaden Hardy, Omari, probably lost a ton of money by choosing to go play in the G League because he, was a rumored top 5 pick coming out of high school, and he ended up at number 37.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the worst case scenario for him. And I'm curious to see how guys kind of make their decisions as far as college and pro, because for Jaden Hardy, it didn't really work out at all. And I think it shows that transition from high school to the G League, it's not an easy one. Jalen Green, I mean, he had a pretty good G League season, but he wasn't like outstandingly efficient, but he was still pretty good. But some of these guys, they're going to go to the G League and they're going to get exposed, and they're going to lose money, and that's a very real scenario that for a lot of guys, it's not going to be a no-brainer good decision. I think Hardy's somewhat unique in the sense that he is a guard who really only scores the ball, not a great playmaker, not a great defender. So if you're an NBA team and you're taking him, it's like, well, if he can't be at least an average scorer, he's not going to be an NBA player. And even then, he's just Austin Rivers, right? Like, do we want to use a pick with a guy who's Austin Rivers? We could just go out and find that guy for pretty cheap in free agency. So that could just be more of a skill set evaluation type deal. Because on the other hand, you have a guy in, I would say his name correctly, Ousmane Dieng, who went 11th to OKC. And he was overseas and didn't really have a great season until he kind of caught fire toward the end. But as a guy who's like 6'10", very fluid handle, kind of look long term, and it's like, okay, well, this guy will be able to give us value, even if he's not like an elite scorer. I think that's just an interesting thought exercise as far as some guys just having games more malleable and lend himself more to upside, and Jaden Hardy probably doesn't. So definitely curious to see if the Ignite continue to get these top guys, if they could see Jaden Hardy and think, well, maybe this isn't the right fit for me.
Well, and I think his own teammates showcased that as well. Dyson Daniels went number 8. So going and playing for the G League Ignite sure as heck didn't hurt him. And probably the weakest point of his game, or one of, is shooting. And so like you could see that, prioritizing, again, if you're not going to be a star or a number 1, number 2, number 3 option, can you do all these other things? Even teammate Marshawn Beauchamp went, I believe, number 24 to the Bucks. And so he went higher than Jaden Hardy. So it wasn't like just going to the Ignite is, lowering the draft stock. It was about context. So I'm glad you brought that up. Maybe it's just the player that Hardy is and how the league valued that, or valued him in general. A couple other ones real quick. John Butler, the 7-footer out of Florida State, at time of the recording, he's not even on he hasn't even been picked up as an undrafted free agent, and he's not on a summer league roster. A lot of people thought he should have went back to Florida State. And then the other non-college pathway, the Overtime Elite program. John Montero was a guy that people thought was going to get drafted. He didn't get drafted. Don Barlow's another guy. So those are a couple guys that are interesting and maybe not ideal for that program, that those guys didn't get drafted. It's just an alternate pathway into the NBA.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of these guys, it's just your overall skill set. And I think over time we'll see, players and maybe just their overall camps, agents, whatnot, will be able to more so select the best fit or showcasing their talent as well. If you're Jaden Hardy and your best skill is scoring, you don't give anything else. You want to go somewhere where you're going to put up numbers, right? You don't want to have that be your best skill and then not score the ball very well. Where you compare a guy like a Dyson who's very toolsy and, you mentioned him like 6'7" or whatever, does everything but shoot the ball. NBA teams are always going to gamble on those guys more. And then I think Overtime Elite has some intriguing guys coming in next season as well. So be curious to see where those guys get drafted. And as a whole, I think it's good that we have so many options for players now. They have ways of making money, getting paid before they even get to the league. And it's certainly not uncommon for 5-star guys to flame out at any level, whether it's college or the NBA or whatnot. That hardly guarantees your success. So the microscope's a little bit bigger on these alternate pathways now, because people are like, well, what does it mean for the future of the game? I think it just means that some guys are pan out, some won't, but now they'll make more money before they flame out. So, still bottom line, probably a better outcome for most players than not.
Yeah, I agree. I like the alternate pathways. I like NIL for college players. I love all of that stuff. And it'll be interesting. Yeah, Scoot Henderson is a top, probably, for sure, a top 5 pick right now in next year's class. And so it's going to be interesting if he stays there. He was in the G League Ignite, for those that don't know. He was playing with the G League Ignite this past season, and obviously will this upcoming season as well. Let's leave the episode with this. Your best team player fit. So who do you feel like went to the best scenario, Amari? I'll give a couple and then let you go. I really like Patrick Baldwin Jr. and Ryan Rollins to the Warriors. I think those are great fits for those guys. I think that's a great spot for those type of players to land. Shaedon Sharpe to the Blazers, because I think they'll be patient, let him develop. And then my guy, we couldn't go the whole episode without me mentioning Benedict Mathurin. I do think he's a great fit with the Indiana Pacers, and that's going to be some great backcourt battles between Cade and Jaden Ivey against him and Tyrese Halliburton. So I do think that ended up, even though it's not Detroit, and I will say I still wanted Jaden Ivey, even though I was a big Ben Math guy, I do think that ended up being a good spot for him.
I'm going to go David Roddy with Memphis, just a very Memphis pick. But I think the Grizzlies, their draft philosophy has just been, if a guy's productive, we're not going to let, body type or whatever, or age or whatever, prevent us from taking him. We just are. They got Brandon Clark with a late first-round pick. They got Desmond Bane with the 29th or 30th pick a couple of years ago. 2 guys who were the oldest guys in the draft, but then they come in and they're very productive role players, or in Bane's case, an above average starter. Really when you look at his overall production, average 18 a game. So Roddy again, spent several years in college, overall just highly, highly productive. And teams are well, he's 6'6", 250. Will his body type translate? This and that. The Grizzlies, they have the depth to kind of play him in situations that are most advantageous to him. But also he's just a talented guy, and the Grizzlies just like guys who are talented and can play regardless of whatever downsides there may be. So I'm excited for that one because everybody was like, Roddy has a chance to be the steal of the draft. And then it's like, well, if he's the steal of the draft, why not just make him a first round pick? Like, why would he even fall to 35 or 40 or whatever? So I just thought that was a really good pick for them.
No, that's interesting. It's good. I like David Roddy. I liked him in the second round, but you're right. If you're a team like Memphis, then why not take him whenever you have the chance to take him? I do think it's really interesting. He ended up going ahead of EJ Liddell, who fell into the mid-second round, the kid out of Ohio State. So it was a fun Thursday night. It's been a fun weekend. The fun continues this week, guys. Again, Thursday night, 6 p.m. Eastern, free agency starts. We'll see what our Detroit Pistons do. We'll be back next Tuesday with an episode breaking it all down, everything that's happened, a little preview for Summer League. I'll get a chance to see my guy Omari. We'll go out to dinner, spend some time, hang out, watch those Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren, alley-oop dunks and connections there on Thursday night at Summer League. Thank you for the ratings, the comments. Saw some new ones whenever I looked this morning. Keep those coming, guys. We appreciate the support. Omari, take it away, my friend.
Yes, sir. Shout out to our editor, Kerry Jr. II, our executive producer, Jeanette Delgado, and our other executive producer, Kirkland Crawford. And also shout out to Wes Davenport. We'll see you all next week.